I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Look, this is not a serious attempt to deal with youth unemployment. It is not some way of improving the opportunities for Australia's young to be able to get out there and take up meaningful long-term employment and make a contribution to the broader economy and the community and their own families and improve the options in their own lives. This amendment, the Social Services Legislation Amendment, Youth Employment and Other Measures Bill of 2015, is really just a continued attack on young Australians. If it was serious, I mean, no one could seriously believe the proposition that by withholding support to New Start allowance by a month, that this is in some way going to generate a massive lift and uptake in employment by young people. It is, bearing in mind the 2014 budget, this is a move from what was contained in that budget of going from a 6-month wait down to the 2015 budget of a 1-month wait. But in its wake, does it do anything to actually improve the ability of young people to get a job? The answer is no. This is really just a budget cut that appeals to the prejudice of some that believe that young people, if they really want to get a job, they can go out there and find it, and that it'll be there waiting. And I guess it portrays two things. One, that unemployment, the way it is in this country right at this point, is higher now than what it was under the GFC, and so it is harder to find work. And in terms of youth unemployment, we know that there is a massive difference between the general unemployment rate and youth unemployment. And the second issue is, as well, it's not simply a matter that young people click their fingers and find a job. The demands of a modern economy, particularly ours that's going through transition, and I do want to discuss and linger on this a bit longer later in my contribution, but the demands of a modern economy demand modern skills. They demand a lot more in terms of training people up and getting young people ready for the legitimate expectations of our employers than believing that you'll just simply get it. And so, of itself, believing that this simple measure alone will assist young people is laughable. That won't be the case whatsoever. Getting young people working, particularly in this day and age, requires a very thorough and a much more longer-term view about what is required to get them ready for employers. And I believe it is, again, to the benefit of the young person that they be able to be flexible enough to transition from job to job to job through the course of their work life, but also that our employers rightly expect that the young people that turn up to their doors will be able to meet the inherent requirements of the role that these young people are seeking. So it is, as I said, a bit surreal to believe that this bill of itself will be a major spur, will be a major incentive to drive people on, young people on, to get employment. It is just basically the latest cut to young Australians. We opposed last year's attempt to leave young job seekers with nothing to live on for 6 months, and you can still, as has been rightly reflected by others, in the course of 4 weeks, you still have to eat, you still have to pay bills, you still have to meet the requirements of living in a modern society. So it is a very punitive action, which is not designed, as I've repeatedly said in my contribution to this point, designed to actually address the type of things that will improve the opportunities for young people to get work. I see it in my area. I certainly, and I reflect on some of the comments that were made. The member for Mitchell during his remarks, as have others, have talked about the scourge of intergenerational unemployment. I see it in my area. I have seen people who, and this is actually a salutary lesson about the perils of long-term unemployment, when people get stuck into that long-term unemployment, when they don't find jobs quickly enough, if they've been through a period of transition. In some cases, we've had big wholesale redundancy programs go through some of our major employers. People with specialised skills don't have the ability to move rapidly, freely, as flexibly to other employment. If you don't pick those people up and get them out of that trap of long-term unemployment, they sit there for years. And I've seen in my area the children of those people watch their parent just basically count down the days without going into a job, and then that becomes the new norm within that family. And I certainly am motivated and recognise that welfare of itself is not the solution to people's longer-term prosperity. A lot of people in my area know that to be the case as well. But at the same time too, you can't eat off grass. You can't live off simply hope and nothing else. You do need to find a way from time to time to get you through. As long as that doesn't become an ongoing source of income support, that being welfare, then that is an important point to bear in mind. So I come back to that point. For people long-term unemployed, you need to be able to avoid them getting into that situation. But for younger people, there is a whole string of things that do need to be undertaken to ensure that people do not get caught in that trap. And I've particularly seen on the ground some really good programs, some things that have made a real difference. For instance, Youth Connections. I saw through Marist Youth Care operating out of Blacktown, but with work in my neck of the woods, I've seen them train up young people, put them into temporary positions where they get their work experience, and then they go on to employment, particularly young Aboriginals in my area who've been able to do the social work course through Marist Youth Care, then get on employment, and then go back into their own families that have battled with long-term unemployment, and see them spur their family on to get out there and as well break the cycle of unemployment and open up opportunities for those people to, within the family, to get other work or to get trained up and to get skilled up and open up options for them to change the situation that they're in and see what they can do. And it's been hugely successful in transforming, not just in terms of giving them employment, but seeing them change their outlook on life. So through Youth Connections and through Marist Youth Care, for example, not just in the area of social work, I saw with a major development in my area, the Sydney Business Park, where the application of Youth Connections funding through Marist Youth Care, working in tandem with Mission Australia and with Beacon Foundation. I saw, for instance, the application of that funding get young people trained up in a variety of different roles on the side of those of that major development, and then see other major employers like IKEA take on young people who have been identified through that process, and in a major store that's just been opened in Marsden Park in the Chifley electorate, nearly 73% of the people that are employed in that IKEA store are from local suburbs, and a lot of them young people, and a lot of them trained up through programs like Youth Connections, funded by the federal government, that helps get young people job ready. As I said before, you cannot expect to click your fingers and get into a role. You do need to get trained up and make sure that your skills are relevant to what your employer needs. And I saw that happen in our area. So what happened to a program like Youth Connections that made a difference on the ground, where if you invested in that, what would happen there? With that type of program, you'd think that it would survive. No, it didn't. It actually got cut. The funds in our area were cut for Youth Connections. And Marist Youth Care, to their very great credit, relied on other sources of income within their organisation to maintain the training program, but they had to run down their funds to do so. This is wrong. If you want to see, as I said, you have a choice between making a punitive cut, as is evidenced in this program, which won't dedicate anything more out of this to getting people trained up in an effective, meaningful, long-term manner. You have to invest in skills. The benefit for that, and the general community gets that the type of spending, the investment that is made, this is not a cost, it's an investment in terms of upskilling young people in our community. People get that that is an important longer-term goal and has a benefit of making sure that the skills are there for employers that need them to maintain economic activity in this country. And it is even more so, it's even more important when you take on board this point. The number of manual and unskilled jobs, the jobs that you could just walk into that existed in times past, the jobs that framed the view of some people that believe that young people can get a job if they want to, they just have to go out and seek it. Those jobs of that era, of that time, are going. They are disappearing before our eyes. Technology is disrupting this. These jobs will not be there in the future. The demand is on us in this parliament to think ahead about the jobs of the future and get people trained up. And you need to be able to skill those people up with a very long-term view. It starts in schools. It starts in getting people ready in terms of being able to negotiate their way through technological change and having the skills that can allow them to integrate in their learning and in their way that they work technology. That's why we've been talking so much about getting coding taught in primary schools. Not so much for just the mere fact you learn coding, but you start to get the development of computational thinking and starting to recognise how technology works and framing the way you think about the world in that way. That's why that's important. Making sure that through schooling, and for example, if you were serious about skilling up young people, you wouldn't be denying them years 5 and 6 of the Gonski funding, which is a massive cut to education. The fact that this government will not fund years 5 and 6, the $30 billion cut that we go on about in the budget, which translates in my area to $270 million over 10 years. It's one of the harshest cuts. Our electorate is actually affected, or is amongst the worst affected. That will not skill young people up. That will not help them get on a pathway for the next level of training that they need. For example, in vocational training. Then you look in vocational training, for instance, and what's this government done there? And there is not a track record this government can be proud of in that space. You look, for example, their track record to date, $1 billion in cuts to apprenticeship programs in the 2014-15 budget. They've replaced apprentice support with apprentice debt. They've rebadged and cut funding to the Australian apprenticeship centres. They've abolished the joint group training program. They've put forward no new ideas for training people for the jobs of the future. And this is contained in a media statement by my colleague, the member for Cunningham and the Shadow Minister for Vocational Education. So cuts to school funding through Gonski, cuts to vocational education. What about tertiary education? What about getting people through higher education to build their skills up there? Again, we've been talking about on this side of the fence the need to build STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, getting a focus and a push on there, because these are the skill shortages that are crippling our country. And I've spoken when I was on that side of the House about it, and I'm speaking about it on this side of the House, where we do have big skill shortages in the digital economy. It's been repeated recently through CEDA's work, Deloitte, you name it, Crossroads by Startup Oz, a whole stack of people that are at the leading edge of technology in this country saying we simply don't have the people here that will help power the development of this sector in years to come. And when I was in the States earlier this year, it staggered me. We have 20,000 Australians working in Silicon Valley, which we could well do with here, and it's understandable. They go over there for the experience and skill development. But if we have 20,000 over there, we have 20,000 less here, and we're not training them up. So what happens in terms of higher education? Well, we've seen the type of reforms that this government has flagged. Now, they dispute our claim that this will lead to $100,000 degrees. We actually have good evidence to back up our concern, and regardless of what you think, it's clear that prices for degrees will go up, and if you're trying to have more people go into higher education to build up their skills, that price signal will be an impact, where it will weigh heavily on people as to whether or not they will be able to take on those degrees. And from my point of view, the danger is that in a university like the University of Western Sydney, they have to make a choice, recognising people may not have the capacity to pay. What do? Do they pass the fee increase on, or do they simply make cuts to the quality of education and therefore provide a lower standard, a lower quality, a second-class quality education to the people of Western Sydney, which is something I'm genuinely fearful of. Again, the whole issue of youth employment and getting people ready is not, as I said, a simplistic one. People may have a different opinion in terms of some of the things that I've said tonight in this contribution, but it's undeniable that if you want young people ready for the world of work and for them to be able to exercise the full range of opportunities before them, you will need to do it in a way that will see a genuine long-term investment in their skills development to make sure not only that they have the skills when they go into the workforce, but importantly that they've got a capacity and a flexibility to change, because as we all know, you don't just go into the same job. The jobs of old, where you'd go into one place and retire with a gold watch, are well and truly gone. You will go through a number of different jobs. You will require a number of different skills. You will need to be flexible as you move. We need to get young people ready for it. This type of legislation we're debating does not fix that. This type of legislation is just punitive. It is designed to attract a prejudice or to mask a budget cut. It will not meaningfully lead to the type of skills development that we need to ensure people don't need to rely on welfare, which I am all for not relying upon, but rather having meaningful, long-term, prosperous employment.
I thank the member for Chifley.